The NHL salary cap was originally designed and promoted to be a game changer across the NHL to create parity and make all teams have a level playing field. So no matter how deep their pockets were, they could compete and ultimately have a chance to be Stanley Cup champions. Today we're going to analyze a deep study from dailyfaceoff.com and CapFriendly, looking at what teams are actually spending, looking at this year, the past couple of years. Is a really level playing field as the LTIR loophole helping both the top spenders and the bottom spenders. How much of a gap is there actually between the top and the bottom? We'll discuss all that and take a look at the deep numbers coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, today I want to take a look at a very interesting study and article just put out just a short time ago from dailyfaceoff.com and NHL insider Frank Saravalli, who put together this study, of course, with the help of CapFriendly.com to go through all the numbers. Like as I mentioned in the opener, obviously Gary Bettman, the NHL, and the owners have, obviously wanted a salary cap for a long time. There's been one in place for a long time, and it's been designed, according to them, to really push and promote the fact that you want to have parity across the NHL. You want to create a level playing field so that all teams are spending equal amounts or close to it, and basically, making sure that all teams have a equal and fair chance at being competitive, winning a Stanley Cup championship, paying their players, keeping their players, all those types of things to promote parity across the league so that it's hopefully a competitive league. Now, for the most part, we do have a very competitive NHL. I think there's obviously, you take a look at all the teams that are in the playoffs right now. Generally speaking, I think it's, it's not too bad in that sense. There is a lot of parity. I think you could say that on any given night, any team can win any game. And we've seen that on multiple occasions. It's not always the top teams that win all the games. But when you take a look at the numbers and you take a look at the business practices of some of these teams, it's amazing just how differently a lot of these teams look at things from across the NHL. I mean, for starters, without even looking at what they're paying their players, just look at how teams manage their off-ice staff and their hockey operations departments. You have a wide range of sizes and the amount of money that's spent on it. In grand comparison, like the Maple Leafs tend to have the biggest staff and the most expenditures for the management and front office crew. I believe they employ close to 50 people. They probably have the biggest payroll. Of course, those salaries are not all obligated to be made public because there's no cap on what they can spend and all that. But then you have other teams that have like the Senators, for example, or cross-provincial rival, who have known for a long time. And I think a lot of this had to do with the Melnyk spending model. We'll see if that changes as the ownership is about to change in Ottawa, but they've had a very lean and thin staff for quite a long time, ultimately having either the smallest or one of the smallest staffs across hockey operations in the entire NHL. Then you got a lot of teams that are in between and have all different ways of looking at things. But if you take a look at how things have gone here for the past couple of years, there's certainly some teams that are way outspending the rest, and then certainly some teams that are clearly exploiting the LTIR loophole, not just at the bottom of the spending, but at the top too. Like there's a combination of both. The LTIR model is not only helping teams spend well above the cap, the teams that have the deep pockets, it's also helping the budget-conscious teams that are having tight pockets, not wanting to spend as much money, actually spend significantly less than a salary cap floor. For example, we have a salary cap of $82.5 million. We also have a salary cap floor of $61 million. So that's only a gap of $21.5 million. So if you take a look at the teams, that should theoretically be the biggest gap you see between the top and bottom teams when it comes to their spending. They're across payrolls and player salaries that count for salary cap purposes, but that is not the case. In the last number of years, the average, I think one of the ads been about $30 to $34 million has been the gap, and it's because of the usage of long-term injury reserve and how that works out. Now, for example, let's take a look at some numbers from this year. This incorporates, of course, signing bonuses and salaries, dead money, and on the cap that counts in terms of salaries that are buried in the minors or retained salary on players that were traded. And then, of course, like I said, this counts total of everything that they're spending right now. The Tampa Bay Lightning, of course, once again, are the top spending team. The Montreal Canadiens are right there with them. The Lightning spending over $104 million. The Habs, $103. Vegas, $101. Edmonton, $99.7. San Jose and St. Louis not far behind, $96 and $94 million as well. lots of other teams well above. So as you can see, we know there's lots of NHL teams that are in LTIR because of, tight cap situations and having to exploit that loophole. But it's really impacting the amount of overall team spending. So obviously that's quite a number. And if you take a look at the bottom on the list, you have teams like the Arizona Coyotes. Now the Coyotes, for example, are spending $41 million less than your top spending team, the Tampa Bay Lightning. That is a big gap. And of course, out of the Arizona Coyotes, the other thing with that as well is that they went out and they acquired a lot of contracts. Now, for cap purposes, they've acquired players like Jake Voracek and Andrew Ladd, Brian Little, Shea Weber, and those contracts are believed to be covered through insurance at about 80%. So the most that they're spending on each contract is around 20%. So in reality, all that money that counts towards the salary cap floor, 80% of that, of all those LTIR deals, it's not even coming out of their own pocket. So they're actually spending far less. Now, I know at different times of the NHL campaign, we've heard some talk that there are some teams not thrilled with the way LTIR is being used, especially on the bottom end of it for your bottom spenders like the Coyotes. They're essentially skirting the cap floor by quite a large margin. It's just really quite alarming when you take a look at it, just how little they're actually spending out of pocket. I mean, it seemed like in the last year, the Coyotes were, for the most part, not in all cases, but trading just about anybody that was making anything significant. They do have a few players making a decent amount of money, but there's certainly not very many. So the guys, players that improved and earned themselves new contracts, they were basically shipped out because they didn't want to have to spend any more than they absolutely had to. So you take a look at the last 4 years, the Leafs and Lightning have spent close to $400 million. The Lightning committed $390, where the Leafs are $389 million total spend in the past 4 seasons. So that's certainly a lot of money when you think about where the salary cap was at and where it's barely budged in the last few years. That's a significant amount of money. And you can see the Lightning have 2 Stanley Cup championships and the Leafs don't have any playoff victories. Yes, they've made the playoffs all those years, but they haven't won a series yet. So it doesn't really buy happiness, so to speak. The whole thing of money can buy, you can buy your way to the top is not really true in this case. And if you look back at the graph that I've shown you with the season's top spenders, out of the 6 top teams, 3 of them are heading towards the NHL playoffs. You get the Montreal Canadiens, the number 2 team. You've got the Sharks and the Blues, the number 5 and 6 teams. None of those teams are heading to the playoffs. Now, some of that has to do with the fact that they either took on bad contracts during trade so they could get more draft currency. Some of them had retained salary. There's a variety of things that were used because they've known for some time, in the case of Montreal and San Jose especially, that they were not going to be qualifying for the playoffs. The St. Louis Blues was later into the year before that was a sure thing. But it just goes to show you that it's the spending here is not all about trying to spend your way to the cup. I think in the cases of like Vegas and Tampa, that's certainly more of the case. They have deep pockets and they're willing to spend whatever they can to make sure they get there. But, it's certainly interesting to take a look at those numbers as well. When you take a look at the pandemic, of course, 3 of the last 4 years were affected by the pandemic. Of course, looking back to when things were shut down in March of 2020, there was a lot of uncertainty. They came back late that year in the fall to finish the season and have a playoff round to determine a Stanley Cup champion. And then the year after that was a shortened season. And really, even the current season, you could say, still has an effect of the pandemic because of the fact that the cap has not really raised and it's just starting to go up in the last year to $1 million, which is really negligible in the grand scheme of things. Overall, you can see that the pandemic has been very bad for the NHL players. I mean, despite the cap staying flat or at least minimally going up, player expenditures have actually decreased, and the last 3 years are all lower than the year before the pandemic. If you add up all the total spending for all the teams in the NHL, if you go back to the season ending in 2019 before the pandemic and you break that down average per team, and then you look at the same thing for the 3 years since, all 3 years are lower than that year. They still have not gotten back to pre-pandemic levels where teams are spending the same amount. even though the cap didn't go down. Just goes to show you how teams have, on a grand scale of things, like some teams have spent more, some have spent less, but the numbers still come in lower than the pre-pandemic levels, which is certainly, not a good scenario at all. I mean, if you take a look at this year's expenditures, take a look at the teams, another interesting stat, the teams that spend the most on signing bonuses. We know that there's some teams that are just really don't like getting into signing bonuses. Obviously, it indicates that in those cases that a large chunk of the player's total earnings are paid out as a signing bonus, generally speaking, on July the 1st, which gives them a large chunk of their yearly compensation at one time, with the remaining smaller amount paid out over the course of the season. Obviously, players like that because they're, for one, they don't have to wait so long to get their money. And secondly, in case there's any work stoppages or anything of that nature, they are not having to worry about getting paid because they're not, the signing bonuses are not affected through that. If there's obviously the salaries would stop being paid if there's a lockout or a strike, but signing bonuses are not. So that's why some players at the higher levels, especially the elite players, really push for that. Some teams seem to hand them out like nothing, and other teams are quite not so much. If completely different opposite examples here. If you take a look at the top spending teams for signing bonuses, like you got teams like the Lightning, again, $36 million on the books this year for signing bonuses. The Golden Knights, $32 million. Florida with $31. Obviously, Florida's taking on some more money, like the Matthew Tkachuk contract and some of the recent signings they've made have a heavy signing bonus component. The Rangers, a deep pocket team, at $29 million. The Oilers, of course, they pay out a lot to guys like McDavid, Draisaitl, Darnell Nurse especially, $27 million. San Jose, again, $26 million. A lot of that obviously falls under the Erik Karlsson contract and a few others that are higher paying players. So at the end of the day, like Washington's in there too, $26.7 million. Obviously, with a few of their top guys getting a lot of signing bonus money. But again, it goes to show you that it's really not that much of a even playing field. You still have a lot of teams that try to shy away from the signing bonuses. You have a lot of teams that just can't do it because it's a major cash flow thing. If they have a lot of their top players being paid heavy signing bonus money on July 1, that's a ton of cash they're going to dish out at one time. Whereas, if they're salary based, they're going to pay that out gradually through the course of the season. It really, makes things a lot more manageable. Obviously, the deep pocket teams don't mind doing it. But again, it's another loophole that these big spenders have found to kind of have an edge up on their competition. We've seen some players, like, for example, look at the Ottawa Senators when they were starting to go through their rebuild. Some veteran guys wanted to sign long-term and stay, but they could not get the signing bonus money. Look at Mark Stone, Erik Karlsson, the prime examples. They did not really want to leave Ottawa, but Ottawa would not pay them what they wanted. And it wasn't even the total compensation that they wouldn't pay per se. And a lot of it had to do with signing bonus money, which, I get why it's important. But at the same time, at the end of the day, you're getting the same amount of money. Whatever, it's just, it's the way that agents have always will exploit the loopholes. And then, of course, you have teams like the Coyotes actually spending well below the cap. So, you got to think that this salary cap is not really working, I don't think, in my opinion, to its intention. I mean, you have these bottom spending teams that are taking on bad contracts to basically circumvent spending to the proper salary cap floor. So they're spending well below. And then you've got other teams that are spending well above due to the same thing. So you have to think that LTIR might get looked at a little bit closer. At this point, though, the CBA is not due to be negotiated for some time, but you have to think, though, that things can be adjusted and certainly habits can be changed as well. You have to think that some of these numbers should really be looked at a little bit closer by the league and really ask themselves some tough questions if having this hard cap all the way around is really the way to go when you see other sports that have, in their form of luxury tax or the cap has a lot more flexibility to it so that they don't have to find these loopholes and basically going about things the way they are. At the end of the day, you loosen up the cap and create some more flexibility, it's still not necessarily going to have an even playing field because you're still going to have the teams with deeper pockets willing to do more than the teams that are not so fortunate in that sense. So at the end of the day, I don't know that this is really the best system for the NHL and their players. Players' salaries have really not really risen a lot in the last 10, 20 years. You'll take a look back when the cap first came into effect and take a look at where things are at now. Like really, an average player, if you think about how inflation and how everything has changed in that time frame, they're not really making a lot more money. And then instead you get some teams that are spending way more than others. It's not really level playing field. You throw on top of that teams that have a tax advantage because of the lack of a state tax in their areas, obviously like Vegas and, teams like in Florida and other states that don't have that issue. They obviously, players get to save money by not paying as much income tax in those states too. So, there's lots of things between the loopholes and how the spending goes to make this not a very fair cap situation. But the whole purpose of this was to take a look at the wide gap in spending between your top teams and your bottom teams. And it really should not be anywhere near that. It's at the end of the day, it's quite a discrepancy. I really think it's something the NHL needs to look at. I think they really need to examine their cap situation and kind of enforce things to be a little closer so that if you really want to have a level playing field, I think some adjustments need to be made because these gaps are pretty wide and pretty far. But let me know your thoughts on all the spending, how things shake out here. Any surprises to you? Should we see some different contract rules when it comes to signing bonuses? Some rules around LTIR maybe made adjustments or whatnot. Let me know what your thoughts are, and we'll talk about it further down in the comments. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with the latest news, rumors, and analysis of all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.